Well, we finally get to the exciting and extremely disturbing conclusion of the Aeneid today. But before we get to that conclusion, we have to look at all of books 10, 11, and 12. Again, we're not going to do justice to these very rich books, but we'll do our best and look at some of the main themes to each of these three books. So we obviously start with book 10, which opens with another mafia meeting on Mount Olympus. Jupiter, who is not all-knowing, is stunned to see all this carnage, and he asks, what's going on? Why are the Latins and the Trojans fighting? And Venus rightly says, well, Juno is still stirring up trouble because she really doesn't want to see Turnus killed. Oh, great. So Jupiter does something quite interesting. He says, all right, from now on, we will not interfere. We'll only have men decide their own endings. That said, Venus continues to support Aeneas, and Juno very dramatically, through all kinds of weird little tricks with a phantom Aeneas, continues to support Turnus. What's the significance of that? Well, number one, we can see that the gods don't keep their word very well. Jupiter himself, in another book later on, interferes with his own resolution. And number two, though, even if they do keep their own word, and it is true that men decide their own fates, it only deepens the tragedy. So, in other words, we're not hapless pawns, but instead we put the nails in our own coffins. That's depressing too. So, either way, there's just something tragic about human life that these battle scenes remind us of. So, the battle resumes. Aeneas has returned. He has come from Tuscany with some reinforcements, with some new ships. And the battle commences, and Pallas, who is King Evander's son, whom Aeneas has promised to protect, does a very good job, even though he is a young warrior, but he attracts the attention of Turnus. Turnus is incredibly arrogant, so full of himself, goes out and he kills Turnus. And in an act of hubris, he despoils the body of Pallas. He takes his belt and wears it as plunder on his body. This is a desecration of the dead, and it is also an act of incredible arrogance. When Aeneas hears this, he flies into a rage, mows down several Latin soldiers, including a couple who had asked for mercy, and tries to get to Turnus. And then this is when Juno comes in and misdirects Turnus, has him chase a phantom Aeneas onto a ship, and then cuts the moorings. What's going on with this book? A lot of bloodshed, a lot of interesting personalities emerge. Let's talk about three in particular. Turnus. We've already mentioned it. He is incredibly arrogant. And especially with that act of despoiling Pallas's body, it shows a hubris that does not respect the boundaries. Let the dead rest in peace. But no, he's got to violate the dead by stripping Pallas of his belt. So Turnus, again, is like Achilles. He's just hyper-thumotic and a lot of trouble. Another interesting character to emerge in Book 10, after Turnus has turned away, is Mezentius. He is an ally of the Latins, but in an odd kind of way. He is the only character in the Aeneid who is described as godless. The Carthaginians were not godless. They had a kind of a secular, progressive lifestyle, as I've argued, but they did not disbelieve in the gods. Mezentius, Vergil says, cares not for the gods. Maybe he believes in their existence, but he openly despises them. And in another place, Vergil says his right arm was his god. As a result of this godlessness, this almost complete lack of, not almost, complete lack of pietas, Mezentius is cruel and sadistic. He is the head of the Etruscans and he tortures his own people. He is so hated by his own people that they actually side with Aeneas and the Trojans, while Mezentius, almost on his own, sides with the Latins. Mezentius is an interesting character because he's almost the photographic negative of Aeneas in terms of this lack of pietas, in terms of this lack of care for the gods. But there's also a commentary that Vergil is making here. When you don't believe in the gods, anything goes. There are no restraints. There are no external boundaries that you will place on your own behavior. It will unleash this lack of pietas, this lack of restraint will unleash terrible, terrible forces. And that's exactly what happens to Mezentius. And he dies in a pathetic way. He's got it coming to him, but he loses all heart when his son dies. He's got no faith in the gods, no faith in an afterlife. So the loss of his son devastates him, and then Aeneas kills him. And speaking of Aeneas, the third interesting character in Book 10 is our hero. Do you think he's changed at all over the course of this epic? Remember, I asked you that question, or keep an eye on that question earlier on. Remember, our very first impression of him was his knees literally buckling as he faced a storm and wished for death. He was wavering and uncertain. He was tired. How about Aeneas now? Now he's frightening. He flies into a rage when Pallas is killed. He shows no mercy when two Latin soldiers drop to their knees and beg for mercy, but he won't give it. There's something kind of scary about Aeneas. What accounts for the change? Well, an obvious thing is the death of Pallas, which infuriates him. But remember, there's one other big thing that has happened in his life, and that is he has gone to the underworld. The underworld is a real game changer for Aeneas. It reinforces his pietas and also gives him a sense of purpose, gives him a mission. And now that he has that mission, he is an unstoppable train. In a way that's actually kind of frightening. Before Aeneas went down to the underworld, he had no proof that there was such a thing as divine justice. Everything he saw in his life was evidence of injustice. The Greeks beating the Trojans, that wasn't fair. His wife dying in the flames, Priam dying a miserable death, their temples desecrated. Couldn't you see that from Aeneas' perspective, it would seem like there is no justice in this life. There is no justice at all. There is no such thing as justice. But then he goes down to the underworld and he actually sees a place where the just are rewarded and the unjust are punished. And then, of course, he's given his divine mission. Remember, O Roman, these will be your arts. And after that, he is almost literally a bat out of hell. He has emerged from the underworld with this sense of purpose. He's no longer buckling his knees. Vergil is giving us, I think, an interesting commentary on pietas. Vergil obviously is a big fan of pietas. It has a lot of advantages over the godlessness of Mezentius or the hubris of Turnus. But it also has a dark side. Religious zealots can be kind of scary. And there's a way in which Aeneid fits that description in Book 10. Well, we turn now to Book 11, which in many respects is a suspense builder. It is there to whet our appetites for the grand finale of Book 12. But we do see again some interesting characters emerge and some interesting tensions emerge. There's been a lot of bloodshed, a lot of carnage, and so both sides call a truce in order to bury their dead. The Latins send messengers to the Trojans, Aeneas negotiates, and the Latins are extremely impressed with Aeneas. What they are impressed with in particular is, again, his pietas. He totally respects the rules for the proper burial of the slain, even of his enemies. Turnus showed no respect for the dead when he killed Pallas and plundered his body, but Aeneas does. And so again, we see how pietas is a good thing. We also see how his pietas has been reinforced by his experience in the underworld. Because remember, he saw firsthand what happens to the dead who do not receive a proper burial. They have to remain for all eternity doomed, wandering the shores of the river Acheron and never crossing into the underworld and getting a decent afterlife. Aeneas, interestingly enough, doesn't wish that on even his enemy. And so he allows the Latins to bury their dead. The Latin messengers come home and they think, gosh, Aeneas is kind of a decent guy and we're dying left and right. Maybe he should just fight Turnus alone. Wouldn't that be nice? And the other interesting thing of Book 11 is the growing Latin consensus against Turnus. They hold a big meeting and people are getting kind of sick of this arrogant guy. We're beginning to see how that kind of pride and thumos are not really good. They're not conducive to the common good. Turnus is very much like Achilles. He chooses personal honor even over the corporate benefit of the community. He seeks glory, or at least not to be dishonored above all else. And so they offer some reasonable propositions, and Turnus, by and large, tends to be unreasonable. Another interesting character to emerge in Book 11, albeit somewhat short-lived, is Camilla. She is this warrior queen of these sort of Amazon-type warrior maidens who fight really well. But she is slain in battle by one of the Trojans, at which point one of her patron goddesses gets angry and kills the warrior who killed her. Remember, the gods aren't supposed to be involved, but they are involved. Why does Vergil include this, aside from some kind of exotic little side story? I don't know. At the very least, it sort of illustrates the complexity of the issue of women in combat. It's not that women can't perform virtuously or effectively on the battlefield. Camilla and her troops prove that they can. But is there something impious about killing a woman? Doesn't it invite the vengeance of the gods? So it's kind of a sticky situation to have women in combat. I don't know. I don't know where Vergil is going with that, but it is an interesting motif. Well, we come now to the grand finale, the exciting ending of the Aeneid, which is profoundly disturbing, which we'll get to in a moment. It is so disturbing, it is so, in many respects, anticlimactic, that some people have suspected that Vergil did not finish this part of the book. It is indeed true that Vergil had in his will that if the book was not 100% finished by the time he died, it should be thrown into the flames. And indeed, Vergil was still editing the book when he was on his deathbed, and he died with it unfinished. The Aeneid technically is an unfinished work. And they were about to throw it into the flames when Augustus Caesar, recognizing its great value, overrode the last will and testament of Vergil and had it published instead. So we know it's unfinished, but the question is, how unfinished is it? And some people have thought, oh, it's terribly unfinished. He must have intended there to be a 13th book with a more satisfying ending than the one he gave us. You can believe what you want, but personally, I've read enough scholarship on Vergil where I don't think that's true. The best evidence that we have, in my opinion, is that Vergil wasn't planning another book. He wasn't making any major revisions, but he was such a perfectionist that he was basically going over the meter of his verses and trying to weed out every single imperfection. He only wrote 1 page a day of the Aeneid. That's how much of a perfectionist he was, which you can imagine how long it took him to write this. And then even then he was going back and making revisions. So I don't believe he had any major revisions in store. I don't believe he had any new books that he was going to write. I believe what we have to do is confront the ending on its own terms and believe that that is what Vergil wants us to do. But before we get to the ending, what happens in book 12? Well, more shenanigans from the gods. Aeneas and Turnus do agree to single-hand combat, but they go out to have a duel. Juno again freaks out. She sends Turnus' sister, and Turnus convinces the Latins to start fighting. And so there's more senseless bloodshed. And it only stops after Aeneas, after fighting this sort of honorable way against his enemies, says, oh, the city's unguarded. And he invades the city, just like the Greeks had invaded the city of Troy. But now he does it in broad daylight without any deceit. And the tragic Queen Amata, thinking that all is lost, takes her own life. Now Turnus sees this and is very upset, and he agrees to the original terms, single-hand combat. But again, the gods intervene. Juno has finally agreed that she's going to stop mucking around, and so Jupiter says, okay, fine, let's just dispatch Turnus as quickly as we can. And he sends one of the Furies down to terrorize Turnus, to freak him out. And while he's in this sort of panic, Aeneas sees his opportunity, throws a spear, wounds him in the leg. Turnus goes down. Turnus begs for mercy for the sake of his father. And Aeneas is about to grant it when his eyes see the belt of Pallas. Let's look at that scene together, and I'll tell you why, in so many ways, it is disturbing. Aeneas stood ferocious in his armor. His eyes were restless, and he stayed his hand, because he's listening to the words of Turnus. He's remembering his own father. He's remembering pietas, be loyal to your father. And as he hesitated, Turnus' words began to move him more and more, until, high on the Latin's shoulder, he made out the luckless belt of Pallas, of the boy whom Turnus had defeated, wounded, stretched upon the battlefield, from whom he took this fatal sign to wear upon his back, this girdle glittering with familiar studs. And when his eyes drank in this plunder, this memorial of brutal grief, Aeneas, aflame with rage, his wrath was terrible, cried, "How can you who wear the spoils of my dear comrade now escape me? It is Pallas who strikes, who sacrifices you, who takes this payment from your shameless blood." Relentless, he sinks his sword into the chest of Turnus. His limbs fell slack with chill, and with a moan, his life, resentful, fled to shades below. What is going on with this ending? There are so many weird things happening. For one thing, have you noticed how Aeneas and Turnus have almost traded places? Turnus, for most of the book, has been Mr. Thumos, overcome with rage and unreasonable as a result. Whereas Aeneas is Mr. Pietas, restraint, respect the boundaries, loyalty, blah, blah, blah. And in this moment, they seem to have changed places. Turnus is the one who makes an appeal to Pietas. Have mercy on me for the sake of my father. Whereas Aeneas is the guy who is overcome with rage. His wrath was terrible. In other words, he's Mr. Pietas the whole book, but in this one crucial moment, he completely forgets about Pietas and instead is just pure thumos. Rage, anger. They've almost seemed to have traded places. So that's really weird. That's weird point number one. Weird point number two is, what happened to Anchises' advice? Command about the Romans? Remember that crucial speech in Book 6 in the Underworld, where Anchises says, "Remember, O Roman, these will be your arts. To subdue peoples, to spare the defeated, and tame the proud." Well, that's kind of a conflict right there. Aeneas definitely tamed the proud. That's one way to tame the proud. But did he spare the defeated? Doesn't seem like it. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think that's a good definition of taming the proud. To tame means to domesticate, to subdue. When you get a wild horse, you don't tame it by killing it. You tame it by breaking it. That's the phrase that's used, right? Or whispering to it if you're a horse whisperer. But the idea of taming is not killing. He does not spare the defeated. He does not tame the proud. And yet he's the grandfather of the Romans who are supposed to do this. What's going on? What's going on? Oh, and there's one other thing. Remember how we saw Vergil not liking bloodshed in the funeral games? Aeneas stops the boxers from having things get fatal. Gladiator games are not present. And the one thing that the Trojans and the Romans with them abhor is human sacrifice. They're disgusted that the Greeks practiced that, albeit rarely, but remember Agamemnon did sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia at the start of the Trojan War. And of course, the Romans deplore the human sacrifice of the Carthaginians. Well, why am I bringing this all up right now? Because the death of Turnus is portrayed as a human sacrifice. Aeneas is acting, in a sense, as a high priest of Pallas. It is Pallas who strikes, who sacrifices you, who takes this payment from your shameless blood. the Latin te immolat. He immolates you, is a ritual shedding of blood in a sacrifice. That's not a random metaphor. Again, what the heck is going on? This is a very astonishing ending. Why did Vergil write it that way? Well, I don't have any easy answers, but I think if we put a few clues together, perhaps we can surmise a guess. Remember, the overriding purpose of our course is to answer the question, what is the best way to live? How should we live? And we saw some very good answers in Plato's Republic. Socrates at the end of Book 10 basically gives us two options: to be just by habit or to be just by philosophy. The people who are just by habit are a lot like the guardians of the Republic. They're honest and brave and loyal and true, but they are pretty much kept in the dark. They are deceived by a noble lie, which serves as a kind of surrogate reason that keeps them on the straight and narrow. And Socrates' whole point is that's better than nothing, but it's not ideal. The best thing is to be just by philosophy, to be just by having gotten outside the cave, or at least trying to get outside the cave, and to have not surrogate reason, but your own reason, serve as a guide to how to live the best life. Because your own reason is not making up stuff as it goes along, but it has gotten outside the cave, sees the eternal forms, and knows how to guide itself properly. I mention that to ask you about the Aeneid. Where do you think Vergil would fall on this? Well, let's start with Vergil's hero, who is, of course, we can scratch this guy out, Aeneas. He is renowned for his pietas. Is pietas wisdom? Is pietas the full use of your reason? Not really. It's a certain amount of trust, and that's good. And there are a lot of virtues that go with that, and we certainly see how it's better than the life of Turnus or Mezentius, or certainly of Ulysses and some of these other characters. But basically what I'm getting at is Aeneas is not a philosophical figure. If you were to compare him to anything in the Republic, he is more like the guardian, living under a noble lie about a divine mission, than he is the philosopher king. He is not a philosopher king. He is a guy who takes orders, does his job. He is the guardian. So, if that's the case, is there a philosopher king or any kind of philosopher figure in the Aeneid? I don't think there is. But what about the author of the Aeneid? What about Vergil himself? Remember how Book 6 ends, where Aeneas exits the underworld. He exits through the gate of ivory, through the gate of false teeth. Vergil is the poet of that false dream, is he not? It was his gate of ivory that uttered this whole story that we've just read. And maybe Vergil, in the very last portion of the book, is pointing out the intrinsic limits of pietas. It is a good thing. It is a good myth to have, but it's not getting outside the cave. It is not the life of pursuing wisdom on its own. Vergil calls Aeneas many things, many good things in the Aeneid, but the one thing he never calls him is happy. And the only time Vergil in his poetry defines happiness is in another work called the Georgics, where he says, "Happy is the man who knows the causes of things." That is the definition of a wise man, a philosophically wise man. That definition could have come straight out of Aristotle. Happy is the man who knows the causes of things. Aeneas is dutiful, but he is not truly happy. My suspicion is that Vergil has written the Aeneid as a noble lie for the Roman people in order to have the majority of them, who can't aspire to anything better, to live better lives through the virtue of pietas. He is the philosopher-poet who is trying to use these noble lies to encourage them to become just by habit. But as the philosopher-poet of this noble lie, he knows it's a lie. He knows there's no divine promise for imperium sine fine, empire without end. There's no divine promise for the Pax Romana. But if he can convince the majority of the population that it is true, then they may live better, more self-restrained lives. And for the very astute minority reader who does aspire to get outside the cave, they can follow the very clues that we have been following and realize, okay, yeah, this is a myth, but let us strive for a wisdom that is higher than that myth. Let us move from these shadows to the reality outside the cave.